If you're so smart, teach them now." The words, sharp as sheared metal, cut through the screaming. They were not an invitation, they were a sentence. Alastair Vance stood with his arms crossed, a monolith in a bespoke charcoal suit, his face a mask of cold fury. He wasn't looking at his children, whose war cries ricocheted off the 20-foot ceilings and polished marble floors. He was looking at Alara. She stood by the archway of the great room, a space so vast and wide it felt less like a home and more like a gallery for loneliness. Her gray uniform was a smudge of humility against the stark, intimidating art on the walls. In her hand a feather duster drooped, its purpose forgotten. She had been on her way to dust the sterile glass shelves when the storm had erupted. It always erupted. Leo and Lily, 6 years old and identical in their golden-haired fury, were locked in a battle over a single, insignificant object. A small, wooden bird, its painted blue wings chipped from countless previous wars. "It's mine," Lily shrieked, her face a blotchy, tear-streaked mess. She yanked, her small fingers white-knuckled. Leo and Lily, 6 years old and identical in their golden-haired fury, were locked in a battle over a single, insignificant object, a small, wooden bird, its painted blue wings chipped from countless previous wars. "It's mine," Lily shrieked, her face a blotchy, tear-streaked mess. She yanked, her small fingers white-knuckled. "I had it first," Leo roared back, pulling with all his might. The bird was caught between them, a fragile effigy of peace being torn apart. "You always take everything." The sound they made was primal, a raw, unfiltered agony that the house, for all its wealth and curated silence, could not absorb. It bounced off the floor to ceiling windows that overlooked a manicured, joyless garden. It rattled the skeletal chandelier that hung like a cage of ice from the ceiling. This was the sound of the Vance household's true architecture, a foundation of emotional neglect papered over with obscene wealth. Alara's heart, a steady, practiced drum, did not quicken. It did, however, ache. She had been here for 6 months, and in that time she had learned the rhythms of this family. There were the long, echoing silences when Mr. and Mrs. Vance were out, which was most of the time. There were the stilted, transactional conversations during the rare moments they were home. And then there was this, the screaming. The children were not angry about a wooden bird. They were screaming for attention, for boundaries, for a hand to hold that wasn't checking a watch. Alastair Vance took a step forward, his Italian leather shoes making no sound on the expensive Persian rug. He was a man who conquered boardrooms, who orchestrated hostile takeovers, whose net worth was discussed in hushed, reverent tones in financial journals. Yet here in his own home he was utterly, impotently lost. He saw the chaos not as a symptom of his family's pain, but as a flaw in his domestic machinery. The nannies quit. The therapists offered expensive, useless advice. And Alara, the housekeeper he'd hired for her quiet efficiency, was just the latest component to witness the system's failure. His gaze on her was heavy, dismissive. It was the same look he gave a faulty appliance. "Well," he demanded, his voice dropping into a register of pure threat. "You stand there every day watching, judging, I'm sure, thinking you know better than the experts we hire." Alara's face remained neutral, a placid lake over a deep well of feeling. She did not judge. She observed. She saw how Lily's tantrums were always louder when her mother was preparing to leave for a business trip. She saw how Leo's aggression spiked after his father took a work call in the middle of reading him a bedtime story. She saw everything they couldn't or wouldn't see. Would you endure this? To be seen as a fixture, a shadow, yet be expected to hold the emotional weight of a collapsing home? She gave a slow, deliberate blink. Her hands, calloused from years of silent, diligent work, remained steady. She knew what he wanted. He wanted her to fail. He wanted to confirm his belief that the problem was unfixable, that the children were simply difficult. It absolved him of responsibility. He was paying for a solution, and if no solution existed, it wasn't his fault. It was a bad investment, and he would simply cut his losses. Her job was on that balance sheet. "I asked you a question," Alastair pressed, his impatience turning the air brittle. The wooden bird in the children's hands creaked ominously. Alara met his gaze. Her own eyes were dark and deep, and for a fleeting moment the sheer force of her quiet attention seemed to give him pause. She wasn't afraid of him. He was just a taller, wealthier, more articulate version of his own screaming son, desperate to control a world that refused to bend to his will. She inclined her head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement, not subservience. She took a single, silent step out of the archway and onto the vast, white stage of the great room. The feather duster was left behind. The battle between the twins reached its crescendo. With a sharp crack, the wooden bird splintered. One blue wing flew from Leo's grasp, the body remained in Lily's. The shock of its destruction stunned them into a momentary, gasping silence. Then came the deluge. Both children collapsed into racking, heartbroken sobs, the shared loss more devastating than the fight for ownership had been. Alistair threw his hands up in disgust. "Useless," he muttered, the word aimed at the children, at the broken toy, at the entire miserable scene, but his eyes were still on Alara. The challenge remained, hanging in the air thick with the scent of expensive air freshener and raw despair. Teach them. The unspoken dare echoed in the sudden, sorrowful quiet. The house, finally, was listening. Alistair Vance's arms remained crossed, a physical manifestation of his skepticism. He watched Alara as a scientist might watch a volatile experiment, expecting an explosion. He had seen this scene play out a dozen times with a rotating cast of expensive professionals. There was the behavioral psychologist who had prescribed a rigid sticker chart system that Leo had ceremoniously set on fire. There was the cheerful British nanny, armed with a degree in early childhood education, who had lasted precisely 4 days before fleeing in tears, muttering about the house being a place with no air. They had all come with binders, with methodologies, with the hollow confidence of the highly paid. They had all failed, and now here was Alara, the housekeeper, armed with nothing but her silence. His contempt was a palpable thing, an invisible wall between them. He saw her simple uniform, her lack of academic credentials, and the quiet way she moved through his home, and he had already drawn his conclusions. She was staff, a function. She was here to erase messes, not to understand their origins. As the children's sobs filled the room, a desolate, final sound, Alara did something he didn't expect. She didn't rush toward them. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood for a moment, a beacon of calm in their sea of sorrow, and took a slow, deep breath. Then her hand slipped into the pocket of her apron. Her fingers closed around a familiar shape, a small stone, worn smooth by 1,000 turns of her thumb. It was a simple river stone, dark and cool, something she'd picked up from a creek bed years ago, a lifetime away from this sterile mansion. It was her anchor, a small piece of the real, unpretentious earth she could hold on to in a house made of glass and steel. He couldn't see it, of course. To him, her hand was just resting in her pocket. But for Alara, the touch of the stone was a grounding force. It reminded her that the loudest storms eventually pass, that even the hardest rock can be softened by time and persistence. Alistair let out a short, derisive scoff. "What are you going to do?" he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "Offer them a biscuit. I'm sure your simple methods are just what they need." The microaggression landed, as intended, with the sharp sting of a slap. Simple. The word was meant to diminish her, to put her in her place, to remind her that her world was small and unsophisticated compared to his. He believed complexity was the domain of the educated and the wealthy. He could not imagine that the most profound truths were often the simplest. Would you tolerate this? Being reduced to a caricature, while you were the only one in the room with a real answer. Alara's expression did not change, but deep inside, a quiet resolve hardened within her. He had mistaken her silence for emptiness. He was about to learn that the most powerful forces are often the ones you cannot see. The weight of the stone in her pocket was more than just a physical sensation. It was the weight of her conviction. Her fingers tightened around it, a silent promise to herself. She would not fail, not for him, but for the 2 small, shattered souls weeping on his priceless rug. The temporary peace created by the toy's destruction was just that, temporary. The shared grief was a fragile truce, and it shattered as soon as Leo pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at his sister. "You broke it." He wailed, scrambling to his feet. "It was my favorite and you broke it." "You were pulling too hard," Lily screamed back, rising to meet his charge. "You break everything." The argument reignited, but this time it was different. It was no longer about possession. It was about blame. It was a raw, desperate attempt to offload the crushing weight of their unhappiness onto each other. They circled the fragments of the wooden bird like miniature vultures, their small bodies vibrating with a rage too large for them to contain. Alara started to move toward them, her steps slow and deliberate, but Alistair's voice cracked through the air like a whip. "Stay back," he commanded. "Let's see where this goes." He was testing a theory, the cruel theory of a detached observer. He wanted to see the absolute bottom. The bottom arrived with shocking speed. Leo, in a final explosive burst of frustration, lunged forward and shoved his sister. It wasn't a playful push, it was a violent two-handed shove born of misery. Lily, caught off balance, stumbled backward. Her heel caught on the edge of the thick rug, and she went down hard, her head hitting the unforgiving marble floor with a sickening thud. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. Leo froze, his hands still outstretched, his eyes wide with a horror that eclipsed his anger. Lily lay still, a crumpled heap of pink fabric and golden hair. Then a sound emerged from her that was unlike any of her previous cries. It was a thin, high-pitched wail of pure, unadulterated pain. Alistair, for the first time, moved. He strode forward, his face ashen, and knelt beside his daughter, his hands hovering uselessly over her. "Lily, Lily, are you all right? Talk to me." Lily just screamed, a continuous, piercing sound that signaled real hurt. A small, dark blotch was already beginning to form on the back of her head. Alistair's head snapped up and his eyes found Alara. The detachment was gone, replaced by a terrifying, cold fury. All his frustration, his inadequacy as a father, his inability to control his own home, it all coalesced and found its target, her. He rose to his full height, a towering figure of blame. His voice was dangerously low, each word a perfectly enunciated threat. "This," he hissed, gesturing to the scene, his weeping daughter, his terrified son, the wreckage of their afternoon, "is what happens on your watch." It was irrational, unjust, and utterly absolute. He pointed a trembling finger at her, the finality in his tone chilling her to the bone. "Fix this, now." He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. "Or don't bother coming back tomorrow." The ultimatum landed, locking into place with the cold, hard click of a cell door. This was no longer a challenge or a taunt. It was a condition of her employment. Her job, her livelihood, the very roof over her head, now depended entirely on her ability to bring peace to a war she hadn't started in a home that had never known it. There was no walking away, no refusing the task. She was locked in. The only way out was through. With the threat still hanging in the air, Alara walked past Alistair. She did not look at him. Her entire focus narrowed to the two children at the heart of the chaos. She knelt on the cold marble, positioning herself not between them but beside them, an ally entering their circle of pain. She didn't speak. She didn't touch them. She simply began to hum. It was a low, gentle, rhythmic sound, a simple, nameless tune from her childhood. It was the sound of her grandmother shelling peas on a porch, the sound of rain on a tin roof, the sound of safety. The melody was steady, unwavering, a thread of calm woven directly into the fabric of their hysteria. At first, the children didn't seem to notice. Lily's wails continued and Leo's panicked breaths came in ragged gasps, but Alara's humming was persistent. It did not try to overpower their noise, it simply existed alongside it, an invitation to a quieter place. Slowly, miraculously, it began to work. Lily's screams softened into hiccuping sobs. Leo's frantic gaze, which had been darting around the room, finally settled on Alara. The humming was the key that unlocked the door. Now she opened it. She reached into her apron pocket and drew out the listening stone. She held it in her open palm, displaying it for them to see. The stone was unassuming, just a dark, smooth oval of rock, but in the sterile, opulent room its simple, earthy presence felt profound. "This is a very special stone," she said, her voice just above a whisper, forcing them to lean in to hear. Alistair, still standing over them, watched with grudging fascination. "It's a magic stone." Leo sniffled, his skepticism warring with his desperation. "Magic isn't real." "Some magic is," Alara replied, her eyes twinkling with a secret they were now invited to share. "This stone holds a very old, very important rule. The person who is holding this stone is the only one who is allowed to speak. Everyone else," she glanced pointedly but gently from Leo to Lily, "must listen. Not just with their ears, with their whole hearts." She didn't frame it as a punishment or a tool for control. She presented it as a gift, a privilege. The novelty of the idea, the sheer strangeness of this quiet woman with her humming and her magic rock, was enough to momentarily suspend their grief. "It's a listening stone," she explained, giving it a name. This was her skill. It wasn't a methodology from a textbook. It was a deep, intuitive understanding of human connection. She knew that these children, who had everything money could buy, were starved for the one thing that was free, the feeling of being truly heard. In a house where everyone talked and no one listened, the promise of a moment of undivided attention was the most powerful magic of all. She gently checked the back of Lily's head, her touch light and professional. The swelling was minor. The worst of the injury was to her spirit. "The stone helps heal hurts," she added softly, "but only if we honor its rule." The chaos had subsided. In its place was a fragile, curious silence. Alara hadn't fixed the problem. She had created the space where the problem could begin to fix itself. And in the quiet, for the first time, the children looked at each other, not as adversaries but as fellow survivors of the same storm. Alara looked at the two tear-streaked faces before her. She saw past the anger to the hurt beneath. She knew who needed the stone first. With a gentle, deliberate movement, she extended her hand to Lily. "Lily," she said softly, "the stone is for you first. Tell us what happened. Tell us your story." Lily hesitated, her small hand trembling as she reached out. Her fingers closed around the smooth, cool rock. The solidity of it seemed to ground her. She took a shaky breath, clutching the stone to her chest like a shield. Leo opened his mouth to protest, a reflexive "nah," but Alara put a single finger to her own lips, a gentle reminder of the rule. Leo fell silent, his expression sullen but obedient. He was listening. He always does that," Lily began, her voice thick with tears. "He always takes the best things. The bird was singing on my windowsill this morning. I thought it was my friend." Her story wasn't about a toy, it was about loneliness. "He didn't even ask, he just grabbed it, and when I tried to get it back, he pushed me." She looked at her brother, her eyes swimming with a fresh wave of hurt. "You hurt me." Alara didn't intervene, didn't correct, didn't comfort. She just held the space, her quiet presence a promise that Lily's words were safe. When Lily finished, a single tear rolling down her cheek, she looked at Alara, her story told. Alara nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling us, Lily." Then she turned to Leo. "Leo, it is your turn to hold the listening stone." Lily carefully passed the stone to her brother. The simple act of transferring it from one hand to the other was a ceremony in itself, a peaceful exchange in a space usually defined by violent taking. Leo held the stone, turning it over and over in his palm. The anger had drained from his face, leaving behind a pale, vulnerable look of guilt. "I didn't mean to break it," he mumbled, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I just wanted to see it. It has a little gear inside that makes the wings flap. I wanted to see how it worked." His story wasn't about dominance, it was about curiosity. "And I did ask this morning, but you didn't hear me." He finally looked at his sister. "I didn't mean to push you so hard. I was just angry you wouldn't let me see." "I'm sorry I hurt you." The apology, when it came, was so quiet it was almost lost in the vastness of the room, but it was there. It was real. Lily sniffled, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'm sorry I didn't listen this morning," she whispered back. It wasn't a perfect resolution. The bird was still broken. But something new had been built in its place, a tiny, fragile bridge of understanding between them. Alara had not been a judge or a referee. She had been a facilitator, a guide who showed them a path back to each other. The bond that formed in that moment was not just with her. It was a bond between the siblings, reforged through her quiet wisdom. From his position by the doorway, Alistair Vance watched the entire exchange. His face was unreadable, a mask of stone. But his arms, which had been crossed so tightly against his chest, had fallen to his sides. He had expected her to fail. Instead, he had just witnessed a miracle. A quiet 5-minute miracle, orchestrated by his housekeeper and a common river stone. He had no words for what he had just seen. For the first time in a long time, the master of the house was utterly, completely speechless. As Alara watched the twins quietly examining the two halves of the broken bird together, a shared project now instead of a contested prize, she felt a sliver of hope. But she also understood the immense fragility of this moment. The piece was real, but the system that created the war remained firmly in place. That was the trap. The trap wasn't a clause in a contract or a loophole in a policy. It was the invisible architecture of the Vance family itself. It was a structure built with the finest materials, money, prestige, power, but it was emotionally uninhabitable. The foundation was a transactional understanding of love. Good grades were rewarded with expensive gadgets, tidy rooms were met with temporary approval, and emotional outbursts were treated as malfunctions to be corrected or ignored. Alastair and his wife, Catherine, were the architects. They managed their children's lives like a portfolio, scheduling their activities, monitoring their performance, and outsourcing their emotional well-being to a series of hired professionals. They provided everything except the one thing the children truly needed: their consistent, attuned presence. The twins' constant fighting wasn't a behavioral problem. It was a desperate, primal scream against the crushing loneliness of their gilded cage. Alara saw this with a clarity that was both a gift and a burden. Her role, as defined by Alastair's ultimatum, was to fix the children's behavior, but to treat the symptom while ignoring the disease would be a fool's errand. The sticker charts and behavioral therapies had all failed for this exact reason. They were attempts to patch the cracks in the walls without addressing the faulty foundation. To truly succeed, she couldn't just manage the children's conflicts. She had to teach them a new way of being, a new language of connection and empathy. And that was the heart of the trap. Her job description was clear: housekeeper. She was paid to maintain the physical order of the house, to dust the shelves, polish the floors, and erase any signs of mess. Alastair had made the boundaries explicit. She was not a nanny, not a therapist, not family. She was the help. To offer the children what they truly needed, emotional guidance, consistent warmth, a model for healthy communication, was to cross that line. It was an act of insubordination disguised as care. If she complied with the unspoken rules of her station and used authority and punishment to quiet the children, the chaos would inevitably return, and she would be fired for her incompetence. But if she resisted those rules and continued to build a genuine, healing bond with the children, she risked being fired for overstepping her bounds, for becoming too important, for succeeding where the family's own matriarch and patriarch had failed. Either path was a risk: comply and lose their trust, or connect and lose her job. If you were there, would you step closer or stay silent? She looked down at the listening stone, which Leo had placed carefully on the rug between them. It was a simple tool, but in this house, it was a revolutionary act. It represented a value system that was in direct opposition to everything the Vance household stood for. It prioritized listening over speaking, empathy over authority, and connection over control. To continue to use, it was to wage a quiet, gentle war against the very culture of the family that employed her. It was a dangerous, necessary choice. The fragile peace held for 3 days. It was a quiet, tentative truce, marked by small, revolutionary changes. Leo asked to borrow a toy instead of grabbing it. Lily helped Alara fold laundry, her small hands inexpertly mimicking Alara's precise movements. They had 2 more listening stone sessions, one to negotiate who got to choose the evening movie, and another to resolve a dispute over a shared tablet. The house was not silent, but the sounds were different: the low murmur of cooperative play, the rustle of book pages turning, the sound of children's laughter. It was a revelation. Alastair watched from a distance, his silence a mixture of awe and suspicion. He said nothing more about the incident, nothing about his ultimatum. He simply observed, a man studying a foreign language he did not yet understand. The setback came on a Thursday afternoon in the form of Catherine Vance. Catherine was a woman who moved through the world with the brisk, frictionless efficiency of a high-speed train. Her life was a series of scheduled appointments, board meetings, and charity galas. She was beautiful, intelligent, and as emotionally remote as a distant star. She loved her children in the abstract, the way one loves a valuable and promising investment. She returned from a 3-day business trip to find Alara and the twins sitting in a circle on the living room floor. The listening stone was in Lily's hand. They were not playing. They were in the middle of a quiet, serious discussion about a nightmare Lily had the night before. The scene was one of intimate, focused calm. Catherine stopped dead in the doorway, her designer handbag slipping from her shoulder. Her face, usually a study in controlled neutrality, hardened into a mask of sharp disapproval. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the peaceful atmosphere. The children flinched. Alara looked up, her expression calm, but a familiar tension coiled in her stomach. "We are just talking, Mrs. Vance," Alara said evenly. "This does not look like talking," Catherine retorted, striding into the room. Her heels clicked sharply on the floor. "This looks like one of those ridiculous therapy games. And you," she said, her gaze pinning Alara to the spot, "are not a therapist. You are a housekeeper." The words were designed to wound, to remind Alara of her place in the hierarchy. "You are paid to clean this house and manage its upkeep. You are not paid to play games on the floor or to psychoanalyze my children." She gestured dismissively at the stone in Lily's hand. "Stop filling their heads with this nonsense and get back to your duties. The guest bathroom on the second floor is a disgrace." Alara looked toward the archway, where Alastair had appeared, drawn by his wife's raised voice. She looked at him, a silent appeal in her eyes. He had seen the miracle. He had seen the change in his children. He could speak up, defend her, explain what he had witnessed. He said nothing. He met her gaze for a brief, loaded second, then looked away, his silence a clear and devastating betrayal. In the face of his wife's authority, he had retreated, sacrificing the fragile progress they had made to avoid a confrontation. Alara felt a chill seep into her bones. She was utterly alone. The small gains of the past few days felt like they were dissolving into thin air. She slowly rose to her feet, the warmth of the small circle on the floor instantly replaced by the cold, vast emptiness of the room. "Of course, Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice betraying none of her inner turmoil. She gently took the stone from Lily's hand and slipped it back into her apron pocket. It felt heavy now, like a secret she was being forced to keep. What would you sacrifice to stay true? She knew the answer. But she also knew that, for now, the battle was lost. The house reverted to its old, familiar chill. The listening stone remained in Alara's pocket, a silent, dormant power. The brief period of calm was erased, and the tension returned, thicker than before. The twins, sensing the shift in the emotional atmosphere, became more volatile than ever. They fought with a renewed, desperate intensity, their arguments echoing through the halls like a declaration of the family's failure. The breaking point came on a Saturday night. The Vances were hosting a small, important dinner party. Alastair was trying to close a deal with a potential investor, and Catherine was charming the man's wife. Everything was meant to be perfect. But the twins, who were supposed to be quietly watching a movie in their playroom, had other plans. A vicious argument over which movie to watch escalated into a full-blown war. Their screams tore through the polite, murmured conversation downstairs, ripping a hole in the carefully constructed facade of the perfect family. Alastair excused himself, his face a tight, furious knot. Catherine followed, her smile frozen on her face. Alara, who was in the kitchen overseeing the catering staff, heard the commotion and knew what was happening. She heard Alastair's booming voice, followed by Catherine's sharp, commanding tones. She heard them deploy their entire arsenal of failed tactics, threats to cancel Christmas, orders to go to their rooms, the promise of punishment. It was like throwing gasoline on a fire. The twins' screams only grew louder, wilder. A lamp crashed to the floor. Alara saw the caterers exchange nervous glances. She saw the guests downstairs shift uncomfortably in their seats. The entire fragile illusion of the Vance household was shattering in real time. 10 minutes later, the playroom door flew open and Alastair stormed out, his face pale with a mixture of rage and utter defeat. Catherine was close behind, her composure finally cracking. The children were hysterical and the parents had completely, undeniably lost control. The deal was collapsing. Their reputation was fraying. Their authority was a joke. In the face of his children's raw emotional power, the great Alastair Vance was helpless. He saw Alara standing by the kitchen entrance, a silent witness to his humiliation. He strode toward her, his movements jerky and desperate. The arrogance, the condescension, the dismissive cruelty, it was all gone. All that remained was a man at the absolute end of his rope. He stopped in front of her, his expensive suit rumpled, his tie askew. For a moment he just looked at her, his breathing heavy. He was a king whose castle was burning down around him, and he had just realized that the only person with a bucket of water was the servant he had scorned. He swallowed his pride. It was a visible, painful effort. "The stone," he said, the words barely a whisper. He couldn't even look her in the eye. Can you try it again?" It wasn't a command. It was a plea. It was the sound of a man surrendering. It was the sound of a father finally admitting that he didn't have the answer and that the person he had dismissed as simple might be the only one who did. It was the threshold. Alara knew that when she walked into that playroom, she would not be walking in as a housekeeper. She would be walking in as the most powerful person in the house. Alara walked toward the playroom, the sound of Alastair's desperate plea echoing in her ears. He and Catherine followed a few steps behind her, a silent, defeated entourage. They stood in the doorway as she entered, framing the scene of devastation. This was her stage. They were her audience. The playroom was a disaster zone. Cushions were torn, toys were scattered like shrapnel, and in the center of it all, Leo and Lily were locked in a screaming stalemate, their faces red and puffy, their small bodies rigid with fury. They were so lost in their own storm that they didn't even notice her enter. Alara didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She walked to the center of the room, knelt down, and took the listening stone from her pocket. She placed it on the floor between them. The effect was instantaneous and profound. It was as if she had struck a psychic gong that only the children could hear. Their screams faltered, their bodies went slack. Their eyes, wild and unfocused moments before, locked onto the small, dark stone. It was an anchor in their emotional hurricane, a symbol of the one time they had felt safe and heard. The silence that fell was not empty. It was thick with meaning, with memory, with hope. It was a silence that roared. Did you feel that shift? The moment an entire power structure in a family crumbled and was rebuilt around a single, quiet act. Alara looked at Lily, whose chest was still heaving with ragged sobs. "Lily," she said, her voice a calm, steady anchor. "The stone is listening." Lily picked it up, her movement slow, almost reverent. "He called my drawing stupid," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I worked on it all day, for Daddy. He said it looked like a brown scribble." The confession hung in the air, a small, heartbreaking truth. She hadn't been angry about the movie. She had been angry about being dismissed, about her effort being rendered invisible. Then Alara gestured to Leo. Lily passed him the stone. Leo's face was a mask of shame. He wouldn't look at his sister. "I didn't mean it," he mumbled into his chest. "I just wanted to watch the space movie. I didn't want to watch the pony movie again. I'm sorry. Your drawing isn't a scribble, it's a horse." A watery, hesitant smile touched Lily's lips. "It's a dog." "Oh," Leo said. "Well, it's a good dog." He placed the stone carefully back on the floor and looked at his sister, his eyes pleading for forgiveness. "I'm sorry." "I'm sorry I didn't ask you what you wanted to watch," Lily replied, and that was it. The war was over. The rage was gone. All that was left was the quiet, simple truth. Lara rose and turned to face the two stunned figures in the doorway. Alastair's mouth was slightly agape, his face a canvas of disbelief and dawning comprehension. Catherine looked as if she had just witnessed an act of impossible magic. She had tried to command her children, to control them. Alara had simply listened to them. In that moment, the hierarchy of the house inverted. The degrees, the wealth, the titles, they all meant nothing. Power, true power, belonged to the person who could create peace, and that person was Alara. She had not raised her voice, had not issued a single command. She had walked into a firestorm armed with nothing but a rock and a belief in the power of being heard, and she had brought the rain. The silence that filled the grand, empty house was the sound of her victory. Later that night, long after the guests had made their polite, hasty exits and the children were sound asleep, Alastair found Alara in the kitchen. She was wiping down the last of the stainless steel counters, her movements efficient and graceful, preparing to leave. The house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now, a stillness born of resolution, not absence. Alastair leaned against the doorframe, his power broker posture replaced by a weary slump. He had been humbled, and it showed. "I don't know how you do that," he said, his voice quiet. It wasn't a question, it was a confession. "Everyone just wants to be heard, Mr. Vance," Alara replied simply, not looking up from her work. He was silent for a long moment, watching her. He was a man who solved problems by writing checks, by acquiring assets, by leveraging power. He was trying to fit what he had witnessed into a framework he could understand. "I was wrong," he said finally. The words seemed to cost him something. "About everything. About you." He pushed himself off the doorframe and walked closer. "I want to offer you a new position, not as a housekeeper. We'll hire someone else for that. You'll be the children's governess, a lead nanny, whatever title you want. We'll triple your salary, name your price." This was his default setting, the transaction. He had identified a valuable asset, Alara's skill, and now he was trying to acquire it, to own it, to put it on his payroll. He was offering her the very thing most people in her position would dream of: more money, more status. Alara finished her wiping and turned to face him, her expression gentle but unyielding. She saw the offer for what it was, a desperate attempt to buy the magic he had witnessed. What does real justice look like here? Is it a bigger paycheck, or is it a fundamental change in the world that hurt you? She gave a small, sad smile. "Thank you, Mr. Vance. It's a generous offer, but I must decline." Alistair blinked, genuinely shocked. "Decline? Why? I told you you can name your price." "Because my price isn't something you can put on a contract," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You don't need a new nanny. You've had half a dozen of them. What you're offering me is just another patch for a problem that goes much deeper. Hiring me to fix the children won't fix the family." The truth of her words landed with an uncomfortable weight. "They don't need me to be their parent, Mr. Vance. They need you, and they need Mrs. Vance." She paused, letting him absorb the full impact. "I can help. I can show you what I do. I can teach you how to build those bridges with them yourselves, but I won't be another person you hire to do the work of love for you. That is a job that only you can do." It was an act of profound soft justice. She wasn't seeking revenge or demanding a reward. She was demanding responsibility. She was refusing to be the solution and instead insisting on being the guide. She was offering them not a service to be bought, but a system to be learned. It was a negotiation not for a higher salary, but for the soul of their family. And it left Alistair Vance, the master negotiator, with nothing to say. The following week, the first session of what would become a new family institution was held. It was Alara's idea, born from her conversation with Alistair. It needed a name, a structure, to give it the weight of a formal commitment. She called it the Stone's Rule, elevating the simple object to the level of law within the household. The rule was simple. Every evening at 7:00 p.m., for 15 minutes before the children's bedtime routine began, the entire family would convene in the living room. No phones, no television, no distractions, just the four of them and the listening stone. The first session was painfully awkward. Alistair sat stiffly on the sofa, looking as out of place as he would in a yurt. Catherine perched on the edge of an armchair, her posture radiating impatience, clearly viewing the exercise as a high-minded waste of time. The twins, sensing their parents' discomfort, were fidgety and quiet. Alara acted as the facilitator, the quiet guide. She placed the stone on the low table in the center of their seating arrangement. "The rule is the same," she explained calmly. "The one who holds the stone speaks their truth. Everyone else listens with their heart. Who would like to begin?" Silence. Finally, Lily, the bravest of them, reached out and picked up the stone. "I was sad today," she whispered, "because Mommy didn't come to my ballet recital." Catherine immediately opened her mouth to defend herself, a list of meetings and unbreakable commitments on the tip of her tongue. Alara caught her eye and gave a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "Listen. Just listen." Catherine closed her mouth, a flicker of frustration crossing her face. When Lily was done, she placed the stone back on the table. After another long pause, Alistair, to everyone's surprise, picked it up. "I was frustrated today," he said, the words sounding foreign and clumsy in his mouth. "Because a deal I was working on is in trouble." He didn't look at his children. He looked at the floor. It was a small, imperfect offering, but it was a start. He wasn't connecting with them yet, but he was letting them see a sliver of his own vulnerability. And so it went. Day after day, Alara would initiate the ritual, and day after day, the family would stumble through it. It was a new emotional operating system they were trying to install, and it was full of bugs. There were nights Catherine would sigh dramatically, nights Alistair would check his watch, but Alara was patient and the children were hungry for it. They were the ones who held the family accountable, asking, "Is it time for the Stones rule yet?" Slowly, the system began to change them. Catherine stopped defending and started listening. Alastair stopped reporting his business frustrations and started talking about his day, asking the children about theirs. They learned to speak in the language of "I feel" instead of "you did." The 15 awkward minutes became a non-negotiable anchor in their day, a small island of intentional connection in their busy, disconnected lives. Alara was not the star of these sessions. Her role was to create the space and then fade into the background, allowing the family to do the hard, necessary work of finding their way back to one another. She was not the healer. She was the one who had written the prescription, and the prescription, against all odds, was working. The policy had been named. The rule was being enforced. The system was being rewritten, one listening session at a time. Would this change be enough in your workplace, in your home? Weeks turned into a month. The listening circles were no longer awkward. They were essential. The emotional weather in the house had changed. The frequent storms had given way to a climate of quiet consideration, punctuated by the normal, healthy showers of childhood disputes, which were now resolved more often than not with a child-led version of the Stones rule. Alara's role was shifting. She was still the housekeeper, maintaining the physical order of the house, but she was now also its quiet spiritual anchor. The Vances treated her with a new, profound respect that was more valuable than any salary increase. It was a respect born not of her title, but of her wisdom. One bright, sunny afternoon, Alara was taking her short lunch break in the garden. It was the one part of the estate she truly loved, a small, slightly wild patch of flowers behind the main, overly manicured lawns. She sat on a simple wooden bench, reading a worn paperback, the sun warm on her face. It was a moment of peace, a quiet exhale in her long day. She heard the soft patter of small feet on the grass behind her, but she didn't turn. She knew who it was. Lily walked up and stood beside the bench. She didn't say a word. In her hand she held a single perfect dandelion, a fuzzy white globe of seeds. For a long moment she just stood there, a silent, comforting presence. Alara continued to read, allowing the quiet to be. Then Lily held out the dandelion. It was an offering. Alara marked her page and looked at the small, perfect sphere. "A wishing flower," Alara said softly. Lily nodded, her expression serious. She gently placed the dandelion in Alara's open palm. Her small, warm fingers brushed against Alara's skin. Then she climbed onto the bench, nestled herself against Alara's side, and rested her head on Alara's arm, mirroring the book-reading posture of the woman she so admired. They sat like that for 10 minutes, in a shared, comfortable silence, the warmth of the sun and of each other their only conversation. There was no need for words. In the quiet language of a child's trust, everything was being said. This was not a thank you from an employer for a job well done. This was not an apology for past slights. This was a simple, profound gesture of love and belonging. It was a moment of pure healing. In it, Alara felt her own worth affirmed in a way no paycheck ever could. She was not just staff, she was not just a guide. In the heart of this small child, she was safety. She was peace. She was home. She closed her eyes, holding the fragile dandelion gently in her hand, and felt a quiet, simple joy bloom within her, whose voice or silence helped you heal when no one clapped. The changes in the Vance household were no longer subtle. They were tangible, observable. The ambient noise of the house was different. The screaming was gone, replaced by conversation. The silences were no longer empty and cold, but full and comfortable. Alastair started coming home from work earlier, not because he had to, but because he wanted to be there for the Stones rule. Catherine canceled a non-essential charity dinner to attend Leo's school play. They were learning, slowly and imperfectly, to be present. One evening, Alara was in the library, a room she rarely had to clean as it was almost never used. She was carefully dusting a row of leather-bound books that served more as decoration than literature. Catherine Vance entered the room, holding a new, glossy book in her hands. Alara straightened up, expecting an instruction. Instead, Catherine walked over and stood beside her, looking at the titles on the shelves. "It's amazing, isn't it?" Catherine said, her voice thoughtful. "We have hundreds of books on finance, on art history, on corporate law, but not a single one on how to listen to your own children." It was a startlingly honest admission. She held up the book she was carrying. The title read, The Connected Family, Raising Resilient Children Through Active Listening. "I bought this last week," Catherine said, a faint hint of color rising in her cheeks. She was clearly embarrassed but determined. "I've been reading it. A lot of what the author suggests, it's what you do." She calls it attuned communication, creating a scaffold for emotional expression. Catherine gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. "It takes her a whole chapter to explain what you do with that simple stone." She turned to face Alara fully. The last vestiges of her condescending demeanor were gone, replaced by a genuine, if still slightly awkward, respect. "I saw Leo talking to his father yesterday," she said. Alastair was distracted, looking at his phone, and Leo put his hand on his arm and said, "Dad, I feel like you're not listening with your heart right now." Alastair put his phone away immediately. Catherine shook her head in quiet wonder. "He learned that from you," she said, her voice clear and direct. "That phrase, that confidence to ask for what he needs. That was you. Thank you." It wasn't a gushing apology for her previous behavior. It was something better. It was a specific, concrete acknowledgement of Alara's competence. It recognized her skill, named her impact, and gave her full credit for the positive change she had brought into their lives. It was recognition done right, a quiet moment of professional respect between two women, stripped of the titles of employer and employee. It was, in its own way, a perfect form of applause. Autumn settled over the manicured lawns of the Vance estate, painting the leaves in fiery shades of red and gold. The listening circles continued, now a warm, ingrained ritual as natural as dinner or bath time. Alara's role as facilitator had diminished. The family, particularly the children, now ran the sessions themselves, passing the stone with an easy, practiced grace. One crisp afternoon, Alara was tasked with picking up the twins from a playdate at a friend's house nearby. She arrived a few minutes early and waited by the edge of the playground, watching the chaotic, joyful dance of children at play. She spotted Lily on the swings, but Leo was in a small, tense huddle with two other boys near the sandbox. Their voices were rising, their postures growing aggressive. An argument was brewing over a bright red plastic shovel. One boy had it and the other two wanted it. It was a perfect miniature reenactment of the same conflict that had started everything months ago. Alara tensed, a part of her ready to intervene, but she waited, watching. Leo, who had been a spectator, stepped into the middle of the dispute. He didn't shout, he didn't push. He held up his hands in a calming gesture, his small face a mask of surprising solemnity. "Wait," he said, his voice cutting through the other boys' angry shouts. "This isn't working." He scanned the ground around him, his eyes searching. He then bent down and picked up a small, flat, gray pebble. It was nothing like the smooth, dark river stone that sat on his mantelpiece at home, but he held it with the same reverence. He held it out to the boy who was shouting the loudest. "Hold this," Leo instructed, his voice a perfect, clear echo of Alara's. "This is the talking stone. You talk and we listen. Then it's his turn." The two other boys stared at him, momentarily stunned into silence by the sheer gravity of his proposal. The boy took the pebble, his anger deflating slightly in the face of this strange new rule. He began to state his case, his voice still angry but no longer just noise. He was making a point. Leo stood between them, a 6-year-old mediator, patiently waiting to pass the stone to the next person. Alara watched from the fence, a powerful, overwhelming wave of emotion washing over her. The stone. It had started as her own quiet anchor, a secret comfort in her pocket. It had become a tool to build a bridge within a broken family, a shared symbol of their commitment to listen. And now, here it was, out in the world. It had been transformed from a private object to a family ritual, to a principle of empathy that a child was now teaching to others. Its meaning had multiplied. It was no longer just a stone, it was an idea, a legacy in motion. Did the object's meaning change for you too, from a symbol of quiet endurance to one of generative, echoing peace? She smiled, a real, unguarded smile. The work was not just done, it was growing. Winter arrived, and with it, a new kind of warmth inside the Vance house. It was the week before Christmas. The great room, once a cold, white expanse, was now dominated by a magnificent fir tree, decorated not by a hired team of designers, but by the family themselves. Lopsided ornaments hung next to sparkling lights, and handmade paper chains were draped over the branches. It was perfectly imperfect. The final scene unfolded on a quiet Tuesday evening. A fire crackled in the grand fireplace, casting a warm, flickering glow across the room. The four members of the Vance family were gathered, not in a formal circle, but lounging comfortably on the sofas. Alastair was reading a story aloud, his voice rich and animated. Catherine was helping Lily untangle a knot in a piece of yarn for a school project. Leo was lying on the rug, listening to his father, his head resting on his arms. Alara was there too, sitting in a comfortable armchair near the fire that was now considered her spot. She was knitting, her needles clicking softly, a quiet, integral part of the family tableau. She was no longer just an employee, she was a cherished presence, the quiet architect of their peace. Her eyes drifted to the grand, marble mantelpiece above the fire. In the very center, where a priceless vase or an antique clock might have once stood, there was a small, elegant stand made of dark cherry wood. Resting upon it was the original listening stone. It was no longer a tool that lived in her pocket. It was an artifact. It was displayed with the reverence of a holy relic or a championship trophy. It was a permanent public monument to the promise they had made to each other, the promise to listen. It was the single most important object in the house, a testament to the fact that their greatest treasure was not their wealth, but their connection. Alastair finished the chapter and closed the book. "And that," he said with a smile, "is where we'll stop for tonight." He looked up, and his gaze met Alara's from across the room. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He simply gave her a nod of deep, profound, and lasting gratitude. It was a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had changed, of the miracle she had so patiently guided them toward. The house was silent, but it was not the cold, empty silence of before. It was a silence filled with warmth, with trust, with the unspoken hum of a family that had finally, truly come home. Alara looked at the fire, at the stone, at the family bathed in the warm glow, and she knew her work here was done. Her legacy wasn't a title or a paycheck. It was this peace, this quiet, revolutionary warmth. What if the most important thing we could ever build isn't a company or a fortune, but a space where someone finally feels heard?